guilty, Your Honor.
Not guilty. We have video evidence of you painting over the memorial. Are you going to deny it?
The judge mocked his Purple Heart. Then the veteran revealed a 50-year secret. When 73-year-old Vietnam veteran Thomas Sullivan stood in court wearing his Purple Heart, Judge Harrison dismissed him as a relic seeking attention. But when Thomas pulled out a yellowed envelope marked "Classified, Eyes Only," the courtroom would learn a truth that had been buried for 5 decades. The federal courthouse in downtown Boston hummed with the sterile efficiency of bureaucratic justice. Fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across polished marble floors, while the American flag hung motionless in the corner, its colors muted under artificial illumination. Judge Patricia Harrison presided from her elevated bench with the cold authority of someone who had grown tired of hearing excuses. The gallery was nearly empty, except for a few court reporters and curious observers drawn by the unusual nature of the case, a decorated veteran charged with defacing federal property. Thomas Sullivan sat ramrod straight in the defendant's chair, his 73-year-old frame still carrying the disciplined posture of a career soldier. His dress blue uniform, though decades old, was immaculate. Every ribbon precisely placed, every crease sharp enough to cut paper. The Purple Heart on his chest caught the courtroom lights a small splash of color against the navy fabric. 50 years had passed since Sergeant Sullivan had crawled through the jungles of Vietnam, but his eyes still held the 1,000-yard stare of someone who had seen too much. Deep lines etched his weathered face, each one a story of battles fought and brothers lost. His hands, gnarled with arthritis but steady with purpose, clutched a manila envelope so old the edges had turned brown with age. The charges against him seemed almost absurd criminal mischief for spray painting a name on the Vietnam veterans' memorial wall. Security footage showed him in the early morning hours, carefully adding PFC James Chen to the black granite surface. When arrested, he had offered no resistance, no explanation, only a request that someone contact his daughter to bring him his uniform and a specific envelope from his bedroom safe. Judge Harrison reviewed the case file with visible irritation. Thomas had no prior criminal record, no history of mental illness, no apparent motive for vandalizing the memorial he had helped dedicate decades earlier. The prosecution sought the maximum penalty, 6 months in federal prison and a $5,000 fine, arguing that veterans couldn't be allowed to deface national monuments regardless of their service record. Thomas's court-appointed attorney had advised him to plead guilty and accept probation, but the old soldier had refused. He insisted on a trial, claiming he had something important to say that would explain everything. "Mr. Sullivan," Judge Harrison began, her voice dripping with barely concealed disdain, "you stand accused of defacing a federal monument. I see you've chosen to wear your military costume to court today. Are you hoping to gain sympathy by playing dress-up?" The words hit Thomas like physical blows, but his expression remained stoic. He had faced enemy fire, survived prisoner of war camps, and buried too many friends to be intimidated by a judge's contempt. "Your Honor," his attorney interjected, "my client is a decorated combat veteran who apparently thinks his service record gives him license to vandalize public property." Harrison interrupted. "Mr. Sullivan, how do you plead to the charge of criminal mischief in the first degree?" Thomas stood slowly, his joints protesting after hours of sitting. "Not guilty, Your Honor." "Not guilty." Harrison's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Mr. Sullivan, we have video evidence of you spray painting the memorial. Are you claiming that wasn't you?" "No, ma'am, that was me, but I'm not guilty of any crime." Thomas's voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I was fulfilling a promise." Assistant District Attorney Michael Torres presented his case with clinical efficiency. The evidence was overwhelming high-definition security footage showing Thomas carefully spray painting PFC James Chen onto the memorial wall, fingerprints on the spray can, and Thomas's own admission of guilt. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Torres addressed the 12 citizens who would decide Thomas's fate. "This case is straightforward. The defendant, regardless of his military service, willfully damaged federal property. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial is sacred ground visited by millions of Americans who come to honor our fallen heroes. Mr. Sullivan's actions, however well-intentioned, constitute a federal crime." Torres played the security footage showing Thomas approaching the wall at 3:47 a.m., carefully locating a specific panel and methodically adding the name in precise military lettering. The video showed him standing at attention before the wall for several minutes after completing his work, saluting the newly added name. "The defendant may claim noble motives," Torres continued, "but the law is clear. No one, not even decorated veterans, has the right to alter national monuments. If we excuse this behavior, we open the door to anyone with a grievance defacing our most sacred memorials." Public defender Sarah Martinez faced an impossible task. Her client had committed the crime on video, admitted his guilt, and refused to accept any plea bargain. Worse, Thomas insisted on testifying, despite her advice that it would only confirm his culpability. "Your Honor," Martinez addressed the court, "while my client doesn't dispute his actions, we believe the circumstances surrounding this case warrant careful consideration. Mr. Sullivan is a Purple Heart recipient who served 3 tours in Vietnam. He has no criminal history and has been a model citizen for 50 years. She gestured toward Thomas, who sat motionless in his dress uniform. The name he added to the memorial, PFC James Chen, doesn't appear on the wall because, officially, Private Chen never existed. But Mr. Sullivan knows differently. He carries a burden that has weighed on him for 5 decades, and he's finally ready to share the truth. Judge Harrison leaned forward, her interest piqued despite her earlier dismissiveness. "Ms. Martinez, are you suggesting your client has classified information about this alleged soldier?" Thomas reached into his jacket and withdrew the yellowed envelope. "Your Honor, I have a letter that explains everything, but it's been classified for 50 years and I need permission to read it in open court." Judge Harrison called for a brief recess to examine the envelope Thomas presented. The manila folder bore official Department of Defense seals and classification stamps dating back to 1973. Inside, she found a letter written on military letterhead, signed by Colonel William Hayes and marked "Classified, Compartmentalized Information." "Mr. Sullivan," Harrison said upon reconvening, "this document appears authentic, but I cannot allow classified information to be disclosed in open court without proper authorization." Thomas stood again, his weathered hands steady, despite his age. "Your Honor, Colonel Hayes died in 1995. The operation this letter describes was declassified in 2010, but the specific details about Private Chen were buried in bureaucratic red tape. I've been trying to get his name added to the memorial through official channels for 15 years. He held up a thick folder of correspondence, letters to the Pentagon, the VA congressional representatives, all ignored or lost in the system. James Chen died serving his country, and his family never knew what happened to him. His name belongs on that wall. Sarah Martinez approached the bench with additional documents. Your Honor, I've verified that the operation referenced in Colonel Sullivan's letter was indeed declassified. The specific details about Private Chen's service were omitted from public records due to administrative oversight. With the court's permission, Thomas began reading from the letter, his voice steady, despite the emotion underlying his words. Sergeant Sullivan, this letter serves as official documentation of the events of March 15, 1973, during Operation Phoenix in the Mekong Delta. Private First Class James Chen, serial number redacted, was killed in action while serving as an interpreter during a classified reconnaissance mission. Thomas paused, his eyes finding the camera in the back of the courtroom where a local news crew was recording the proceedings. Private Chen was not officially assigned to our unit. He was a Chinese-American soldier who volunteered for interpreter duty because he spoke fluent Vietnamese and Mandarin. His family was told he died in a training accident at Fort Bragg, but that was a cover story to protect the classified nature of his mission. The courtroom was completely silent now, even Judge Harrison leaning forward to hear every word. James saved my life and the lives of 12 other soldiers when he detected an ambush through intercepted enemy communications. He died drawing enemy fire away from our position. He was 19 years old, and his parents never knew their son was a hero. As Thomas continued reading, a woman in the gallery began to weep quietly. Margaret Chen, now 78, had been searching for the truth about her brother's death for 50 years. She had come to the courthouse after seeing news reports about the trial, hoping to finally learn what really happened to James. Your Honor, Margaret stood, her voice trembling with emotion. That's my brother. My family has been trying to learn the truth about James's death since 1973. The Army told us he died in a training accident, but we never believed it. James was too careful, too smart to die in an accident. Thomas turned to look at her, recognition dawning in his eyes. You have his eyes, he said softly. James talked about his sister Margaret constantly. He carried your picture in his helmet. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as the human drama unfolded. Judge Harrison called for order, but her stern demeanor had softened considerably as she witnessed the reunion between the soldier who had carried a secret for 50 years and the sister who had never stopped searching for answers. As word of the trial spread through social media and news outlets, other Vietnam veterans began coming forward with similar stories. The courtroom gallery filled with aging soldiers who had carried their own secrets, their own guilt about brothers left behind or forgotten by official records. Colonel retired David Park testified via video link from his home in California. James Chen was the bravest soldier I ever served with. The mission he died on saved hundreds of American lives by providing intelligence that prevented a major enemy offensive. His sacrifice was classified to protect ongoing operations, but that classification should never have prevented his recognition. Dr. Lisa Wong, a historian specializing in Asian American military service, provided expert testimony about the systematic erasure of minority soldiers' contributions during the Vietnam era. Private Chen's case is unfortunately not unique. Dozens of Asian American soldiers who served in classified roles were omitted from official records their families left to wonder about their loved ones' true fate. The trial had evolved from a simple vandalism case into a national conversation about military secrecy, bureaucratic failures, and the promises we make to those who serve. Thomas's act of vandalism was beginning to look more like an act of justice. On the trial's third day, federal prosecutors arrived from Washington with orders to halt the proceedings. Assistant U.S. Attorney General Robert Blackwood argued that Thomas's testimony was compromising ongoing national security investigations and that the case should be moved to federal court under sealed proceedings. Your Honor, Blackwood addressed Judge Harrison, while we sympathize with Mr. Sullivan's motives, his unauthorized disclosure of classified information, regardless of its age, sets a dangerous precedent. We cannot allow veterans to unilaterally decide what information should be public. The intervention created a constitutional crisis in miniature. Thomas's right to defend himself conflicted with national security protocols that had been designed to protect military operations. The media attention had grown exponentially, with major networks covering the story and veterans organizations rallying to Thomas's defense. Mr. Sullivan, Judge Harrison asked, "Are you willing to accept a plea agreement that would seal this case and prevent further disclosure of classified information?" Thomas stood for what felt like the 100th time, but his resolve had never been stronger. Your Honor, I spent 3 years in a North Vietnamese prison camp. They tortured me for information I wouldn't give them. I'm not about to be silenced by my own government when all I'm trying to do is honor a fallen brother. The standoff represented everything wrong with bureaucratic secrecy versus moral obligation, with Thomas caught in the middle. The story exploded across national media as hashtag Justice for James Chen began trending on social media. Veterans from every conflict since Vietnam shared their own stories of forgotten heroes, bureaucratic failures, and promises unkept. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial became a pilgrimage site as people left flowers, letters, and makeshift memorials for James Chen and other forgotten soldiers. Margaret Chen became an overnight advocate, appearing on news programs to share her family's 50-year search for truth. "My parents died never knowing their son was a hero," she told CNN. "They thought he died because of carelessness or bad luck. Thomas Sullivan is trying to give my brother the honor he deserved." The Department of Defense found itself under intense pressure to explain why James Chen's name had been omitted from the memorial and why his family had been deceived about his death. Pentagon spokesman Colonel Martinez issued carefully worded statements about reviewing historical records and ensuring all eligible service members receive appropriate recognition. But the bureaucratic response only fueled more anger. Vietnam Veterans of America President John Morrison held a press conference at the memorial. "How many other James Chens are there? How many families have been lied to? How many heroes have been erased from history because their service was inconvenient for some bureaucrat?" The trial had become a symbol of government accountability versus secrecy, with Thomas Sullivan as an unlikely folk hero. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, carrying signs reading, "Honor our forgotten heroes," and "Truth over secrecy." Judge Harrison found herself at the center of a national controversy, with legal scholars debating whether she had the authority to allow classified information to be disclosed in the interest of justice. Federal prosecutors delivered an ultimatum. Thomas could accept immediate probation and agree to never discuss James Chen again, or face federal charges for unauthorized disclosure of classified information, charges that could result in 20 years in prison for a 73-year-old man. Mr. Sullivan, his attorney Sarah Martinez, pleaded during a private conference, "They're serious about the federal charges. You could die in prison. Is honoring one soldier's memory worth destroying your own life?" Thomas looked at the photograph James Chen's sister had given him, a young man in dress uniform smiling with the confidence of someone who believed in his country's promises. "Sarah, I made a promise to a dying 19-year-old that I would make sure his family knew he was a hero. I've already waited 50 years. I'm not backing down now." The weight of the decision was crushing. Thomas had survived war imprisonment and decades of survivor's guilt. Now he faced the possibility of spending his final years in federal prison for trying to keep a promise to a dead friend. But as he looked around the courtroom filled with veterans' family members and supporters, Thomas realized this was bigger than just James Chen. This was about every promise made to every soldier, every family that deserved truth instead of convenient lies. Despite the federal threats, Thomas insisted on completing his testimony. Judge Harrison, facing pressure from both federal prosecutors and public opinion, allowed him to continue under strict limitations about classified information. James Chen died on March 15, 1973. Thomas testified, his voice carrying across the packed courtroom. "He was point man on a reconnaissance mission when we walked into an ambush. James heard the enemy talking in the trees above us. They were coordinating a crossfire that would have killed our entire squad." Thomas paused, his eyes distant with memory. Instead of taking cover, James stood up and started yelling in Vietnamese, drawing their fire. He gave us time to find defensive positions and call for support. He took 3 rounds to the chest, but kept fighting until the medevac arrived. Margaret Chen wept openly as Thomas described her brother's final moments. "He asked me to tell his family he died with honor. He made me promise his name would be remembered with the other heroes. I've carried that promise for 50 years, and I won't break it now." The courtroom was completely silent, except for Margaret's quiet sobs and the scratch of court reporters' pens capturing every word. Federal prosecutor Blackwood made one final attempt to stop the proceedings. "Your Honor, Mr. Sullivan's emotional testimony doesn't change the fact that he has violated federal law. His unauthorized disclosure of classified information, regardless of its age or his motives, cannot be excused." But Judge Harrison had heard enough. "Mr. Blackwood, I've reviewed the declassification documents your office provided. The operation Mr. Sullivan describes was declassified in 2010. The only information that remained classified was Private Chen's identity and role. Information that was apparently classified to cover up bureaucratic failures, not to protect national security." She leaned forward, her earlier dismissiveness replaced by righteous anger. "This court will not be party to perpetuating a 50-year cover-up that has denied a hero his rightful recognition and a family their right to truth." The federal prosecutors exchanged worried glances as they realized they were losing control of the narrative. As closing arguments began, the courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Veterans in uniform filled every seat, with overflow crowds gathering outside. The case had become a referendum on government accountability and the promises made to those who serve. Prosecutor Torres made his final argument. Ladies and gentlemen, we cannot allow emotion to override law. Mr. Sullivan committed a crime regardless of his noble intentions. If we excuse his actions, we invite chaos. But his words fell flat against the weight of Thomas's testimony and the presence of so many veterans who had carried their own secrets and guilt. Defense attorney Martinez kept her closing simple. Thomas Sullivan kept a promise to a dying soldier. The only crime here is that it took 50 years and an act of civil disobedience to honor that promise. Judge Harrison took only 30 minutes to deliberate before returning to the courtroom. Her decision would be remembered as a landmark moment in military justice and government accountability. Mr. Sullivan, she began, you stand before this court having admitted to defacing federal property. Under normal circumstances, this would result in conviction and sentencing. Thomas stood at attention, prepared for whatever judgment came. However, these are not normal circumstances. Your testimony has revealed a systematic failure of our government to honor its obligations to fallen soldiers and their families. Private James Chen died serving his country in a classified operation, and his sacrifice was buried in bureaucratic secrecy for 50 years. Harrison's voice grew stronger as she continued. This court finds that your actions, while technically illegal, were morally justified. You were fulfilling a sacred promise to a fallen comrade, a promise that should have been honored by official channels decades ago. The courtroom held its breath as she delivered her verdict. I find you guilty of the technical violation, but sentence you to time served and community service, specifically working with the Department of Veterans Affairs to identify other forgotten heroes whose names belong on our memorials. The courtroom erupted in applause as veterans stood and saluted Thomas. Margaret Chen pushed through the crowd to embrace the man who had finally given her brother the recognition he deserved. But Judge Harrison wasn't finished. Furthermore, this court recommends that the Department of Defense immediately review all classified records from the Vietnam era to identify other service members whose contributions have been unjustly omitted from official recognition. She looked directly at the federal prosecutors, and I strongly suggest that those responsible for perpetuating this cover-up examine their consciences and consider whether protecting bureaucratic embarrassment is worth denying heroes their rightful honor. Federal Prosecutor Blackwood stood to object, but Harrison cut him off. Mr. Blackwood, this court has spoken. If your office wishes to pursue federal charges against Mr. Sullivan, you'll have to explain to the American people why honoring a war hero is a crime worthy of 20 years in prison. Within hours of the verdict, the Department of Defense announced a comprehensive review of Vietnam-era records to identify service members whose contributions had been omitted from official recognition. The Pentagon also announced that James Chen's name would be officially added to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial within 30 days. Thomas stood outside the courthouse, surrounded by veterans and reporters, still wearing his dress uniform with pride. This was never about me, he told the gathered crowd. This was about keeping a promise to a 19-year-old kid who died believing his country would remember his sacrifice. Margaret Chen stood beside him, holding a photograph of her brother in uniform. James would be proud, she said through tears. He always believed in doing the right thing, no matter the cost. As the crowd dispersed, Thomas remained at attention, saluting the flag that flew above the courthouse. The same flag James Chen had died defending 50 years earlier. The Chen case triggered the largest review of military records since the Vietnam War ended. Within 6 months, the Department of Defense had identified 127 service members whose names had been omitted from various memorials due to classification issues, administrative errors, or deliberate cover-ups. James Chen's name was added to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in a ceremony attended by thousands of veterans and family members. Thomas Sullivan, wearing his dress uniform, stood beside Margaret Chen as her brother's name was officially unveiled on the black granite wall. The ceremony became a catalyst for healing, with families of other forgotten heroes finally receiving the recognition their loved ones deserved. Thomas's act of vandalism had exposed a systemic failure that had denied proper honor to dozens of fallen soldiers. Federal charges against Thomas were quietly dropped, with prosecutors citing the interests of justice and national healing. Judge Harrison's decision became a precedent for cases involving government secrecy versus moral obligation. Thomas Sullivan became an advocate for military transparency and veteran recognition. Working with the Department of Veterans Affairs, he helped establish the Forgotten Heroes Project, a program dedicated to identifying and honoring service members whose contributions had been overlooked or classified. The project led to significant reforms in how the military handles classified service records, ensuring that heroic actions wouldn't be buried in bureaucratic secrecy. Congress passed the James Chen Memorial Act, requiring regular reviews of classified records to identify service members eligible for recognition. Margaret Chen established a scholarship fund in her brother's name, supporting children of military interpreters and support personnel, the often overlooked heroes who served alongside American forces. The fund has provided education opportunities for hundreds of students whose parents served in dangerous classified roles. Thomas's story inspired other veterans to come forward with their own accounts of forgotten heroes, leading to a national conversation about military secrecy and the promises we make to those who serve. 5 years after the trial, Thomas Sullivan, now 78, makes weekly visits to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. He stops at panel 21W, line 103, where James Chen is now permanently etched in black granite alongside 58,000 other names. "I kept my promise, brethren," he whispers, placing a small American flag beneath the name. His arthritis makes the journey difficult, but Thomas never misses his weekly visit. Tourists often ask him about the name he visits so faithfully. Thomas always tells them about a 19-year-old hero who saved 13 lives and waited 50 years for his country to remember his sacrifice. The promise has been kept. The truth has been told, and James Chen's name will never be forgotten again. They mocked his Purple Heart, but he carried a truth that changed history.